All Access Music News.
Hi, I'm Barry Sigman and welcome to another exclusive video interview with All Access Music News. Today we have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Jim Messina. Hello Jim, how you doing?
How you doing, buddy? How are you?
I'm great, thank you very much. Really enjoyed you the other night.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a wonderful evening. The Solvang Theater is an outdoor theater, and when we were doing our sound check out there, it was so unbelievably comfortable, like 72 degrees or 73. Wow. We really enjoyed the whole evening, the whole experience.
The whole evening, temperature-wise, it was perfect. It never got cold, and it was a sold-out crowd, and it was just so well received. I was wondering about how do you classify your genre of music? Or do you classify your...
Well, you know what, I don't classify it as that, and I'll tell you why. Back in the days when I was engineering and producing for Buffalo Springfield, before I joined them as a bass player, I remember hearing like Bluebird on the radio, and I didn't really know what the music was called. All I knew is I really liked it, and I loved the voice, I loved the song, the arrangement, and then suddenly I'm in the studio, and I'm working with these guys as a recording engineer. And through the years that we worked together through Springfield and even in Poco, we sort of coined the phrase country rock. That was what we called it before anyone else did. But to my dissatisfaction, although in this day and age it is country rock, there's no question about it, to my dissatisfaction, by having that label or that brand, we ended up being too country for rock stations to play and too rock for country stations to play. So when I started working with Kenny and producing his record, I made it a point to say, you know what, I'm not pigeonholing him or myself, and the music that we're going to do from here on out is going to be diverse, and it's going to show the talents that we have, what we grew up with, what we listened to, what influenced us. And I think that's what you will hear when you listen to the concert. It's all the music that I've done in my life that I love, whether it's country, folk, Latin, jazz. It's all part of who I am as a musician, and that's how I like it. Just really diverse music.
Well, I was a big fan of Poco, and my mom especially, she listened to all Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, all the more Haggard standard country stuff. So when Poco came around and they fused the two, so to speak, I was just go, wow, I was in the best of both worlds, because I love the rock and the pop too.
Yeah.
And it was just just amazing. You were one of the first.
Well, I think that's the feeling I got as an artist, as a writer, as a singer, as a producer. It's the same feeling you had. I needed to pull that together because my parents listened to Johnny Cash and well, especially, there was Hank Snow and Hank Thompson in that era. And then my dad was into country swing, or western swing they call it, with Spade Cooley, Bob Wilson, the Texas Playboys, and all that stuff. Not to be mixed with Kinky Friedman and the Texas, but
Yeah,
yeah, Kinky. Kinky, I think he's running for governor. At any rate, I too had that same experience, and I think that's why the music was created the way it was, because I grew up with that in my household, and my music was going to be different. In fact, my music, from 13, or I should say younger than that, maybe from 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, was being influenced by the surf music, because I lived in Hermosa Beach. And when I went to Redondo Junior High School, there was the surfers and there was the Hodas, right? And the surfers had the Pendleton shirts and the Converse tennis shoes. And we all listened to Dick Dale, So surf music was like what I had to play in high school, because that's what was cool.
That was it.
Yeah.
And it's funny, that's how I grew up in Jersey, and that's how I used to go, California's nothing but beaches and girls running around in bikinis.
Yeah, what a life, huh?
That's it, that's all there is to it. And then I actually went to Wednesday night on cruise night in Van Nuys. And the first time I went there, met Mike Love.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I just thought, I'm in California.
Should I offer my condolences, or was that a good experience?
Yeah. It was a good experience. We just waved, and it wasn't like we hung out, So So you really, I mean, you were in bands before Buffalo Springfield, and when did you start producing?
Well, I was in high school when I don't know how this guy knew me or met me, but he approached me. His name was Glenn Edwards. He was working at KEZY radio at the Disneyland Hotel. Somehow he heard about me and asked me if I would be willing to produce some records for him. I was probably 16.
Wow.
And I didn't know what that meant. And he said, well, I just want you to do what you do with your music, but I want you to bring these singers in and take the songs that we work and take the band and work up the arrangements, and I'll give you an engineer and a studio, and then you get it recorded. So by that time, I'd already done my first album, which was called Jim Messina and the Jesters, called The Dragsters. So I'd been in Hollywood, and I'd gone through the process of making a record. So I knew what it was sort of about. And then once I went down there and started working for him, it was Ibis Records. He began to tell me, I need you to do this or do that. Here's the engineer, here's the studio. So I'd work with the engineer, and they'd show me how the things would set up, and I'd tell them what I wanted to do, no problem. They'd set up, and we did it. And we made several records with this company when I was 16, going on 17. I graduated early out of high school. I started early. Texas had a different age group that you could start at. So I graduated at 17 and a half. So by then, I'd already been going to Hollywood for a year. Damn near failed high school because I was so much more interested in the music and the studios than my English teacher, my art teacher, Mr. LaPlante.
But you left the memory in there.
I did. He did, and that's why I still paint to this day, I guess. But at any rate, I'd already started that, and by the time I graduated and moved to Hollywood, that little company had gone out of business. But I had made a wonderful relationship with Mike Dureau, who was the engineer, and we were all very poor, and I needed a job. I wasn't working in a band anymore, so he apprenticed me and taught me how to do engineering work, starting first in soldering and cleaning patch bays and learning how to wire cables, balance cables, unbalance cables. And it gave me the basis by which I could stay in Hollywood and eventually apply for a job, which I did, and applied for a job at, Harmony Recorders, owned by Bob Ross. And my first job there was working as a dubbing engineer, where we would actually take a lathe, make the music on what was a lacquer in those days. It would cut on a lacquer, and that lacquer would be used as a dub for people to hear music in publishing companies, and then the masters were cut that way too, where you cut a lacquer disc of a master, they send it to a pressing plant, they take that lacquer and turn it into a nickel mother master. That mother master is a positive stamp, so then they would punch out the vinyls, and that's what you grew up on, listening to vinyl. So I had that experience, and then later, as time went on, I filled the position of a mixing engineer, first starting out as the assistant, and then they needed people there during the day to mix sometimes, because the engineers making all the money were working at night. So I got my hands on the board and learned how to do some simple demo sessions, and eventually made it to the point to where I could get a job working in a first-class studio like Sunset Sound. I mean, I'd worked in other studios before then, but that was the last one, which is where I met the Buffalo Springfield.
So, but you were still playing on the side?
I was still playing on the side. We were actually, Mike Dureau and I had produced a couple of records, one of which became a regional hit in Los Angeles by a group called the Deep Six. And they had a song called The Rising Sun, and they did extremely well, enough to get Joe Saraceno at Liberty Records to steal them away from us and actually make a record.
Is that the Rising Sun?
I don't, not the House of the Rising Sun.
House of the Rising Sun.
The House of the Rising Sun was what, Eric Burton or something?
Yeah. So were you torn between the two? What was your love? Was it the engineering? Or was it
at that age I was like 18 or 19, something like that. I wanted to do music, but I didn't think I was good enough, and so I went to Portland, Oregon, somewhere in that period of time between working as an engineer and getting a job as a guitar player in a band. And we went to Portland, Oregon, spent 2 weeks up there. It never stopped raining. I was so depressed, and the club was a club where they would get into fights and throw beer bottles and stuff the guy who was the leader, had brought his girlfriend, who was the chick singer. And between the two of them getting into fights and arguments, I just said, you know what? I don't dig this. I'm going back to Hollywood, and I'm just going to be an engineer. And that's what I decided to do, was to be an engineer and then hopefully become a producer again.
Until you were thrown in together with
the Buffalo Springfield. Buffalo Springfield, it was actually the person who got me involved with the Buffalo Springfield, I have to say, really was David Crosby. David had booked some time in the studio, and I was the only engineer available during the day. Again, I was the day guy. And so I met David first, and he had an artist that he was trying to get a record deal on, so we cut some demos with the artist. And I was so impressed with this particular songwriter. We sat for maybe an hour and a half and just cut one song after the other, and I was just, for the first time in my life, I was actually drawn to what a great singer-songwriter, in my opinion, was. Even though it was a woman, I thought it was great. I'm used to hearing guys' music. And at the end of the session, I said, well, who should I put down as a producer? And he said, well, David Crosby. And I thought he was Bing Crosby's son. I didn't really, what am I supposed to know? I lived in San Bernardino, right? And I said, well, who should we put down as the artist? And he said, well, her name is Joni Mitchell. So that was the first time I'd ever heard of Joni Mitchell.
Oh,
of course, she didn't have a record deal, but I knew at that moment, when I heard that music, that it was so good, and I was so pleased to see that she became successful, because she deserved it.
What a clear, perfect voice she has.
Yeah.
It's just amazing what comes out of her. And then what a songwriter.
Yeah, and unique, so unique in every way.
So, Buffalo Springfield, you was producing, and then you went to Poco.
Well, from Buffalo Springfield, I was asked by Alman Erdogan, who was the president of Atlantic Records. I got a call one night late, it was about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock my time, and said, my name is Alman Erdogan, and I own Atlantic Records, and I have the Buffalo Springfield signed, and I said, oh, and he says, well, and you're working in the studio, and you're their engineer, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I had a long talk with them, and they need a producer, and they can't seem to decide on one, but they all trust you. Would you be willing to produce it? So I didn't know what to say at that moment, but I knew if I said no, it was not the right answer. So I said, sure. I mean, I had no idea what I was getting myself involved in. And so I took on that job. And so I started to produce them. And about within 2 months of that period of time, I'm not sure about how much time actually passed by. Bruce, the bass player, unfortunately got himself busted. And he was a Canadian, and so he was deported. So then they held auditions for bass players. And they didn't know that I played guitar or bass or any of that kind of stuff, but I held up my hand and I asked them if I could audition, and they went, well, yeah, why not? So what I had done when I wasn't working on the Springfield is that there was a bass player in LA who did a lot of the sessions, and I had met him while I was building studios in Hollywood at a place called Universal Audio. His name was Joe Osborne. And it was there that I got my real hands-on mixing experience, because I was working with Joe Osborne, Dorsey Burnett, Roger Miller, Keith Allison, James Burton. They were all buddies of the studio owners. And they came in to record and do things just to kind of use it as a test. So here suddenly I'm sitting with every great rockabilly player that you could ever want to be around. And that was so inspiring to me.
A song left. We're dedicated to all the ladies tonight. Well, I met myself a woman down in